acceptance of reality, which I referred to at the beginning, ultimately must be the acceptance of oneself. The acceptance of reality, as Marcus Garvey recognized and projected, ultimately must mean the acceptance of our Africanicity, the acceptance of the fact that we are an African people. That seems a bit simple when we state it, and it seems a bit obvious. However, when you engage in psychotherapy, we recognize that sometimes you have the patient who comes into the office who is intellectually aware and can quite often lecture the therapist in terms of theoretical ideas and the theoretical ground for his therapeutic work, but who has not recognized and not confronted himself emotionally, who is not really in his heart accepted what he knows. So what I'm saying here, while we may recognize superficially and intellectually that it is important that we accept the reality of our Africanicity, we must recognize deeply in our hearts, in the very bottoms of our psyches, our Africanicity. To a good extent, a lot of the pathology of the African people today is this vain hope that somehow we will be able to escape our African heritage. That somehow the white man will become colorblind and will not see us for who and what we are. That somehow we will be looked upon as some kind of abstraction, as just a man, not as an African man, not as a black man, but as a man, as a human being only, without culture, without recognition, without identity. And too many of us want to shed our Africanicity for this kind of bogus, abstract existence, which is no existence at all, which is the ultimate acceptance of invisibility. We must recognize that we are an African people and we will be an African people to the end of time, and we must accept all that goes with that. We must accept the goods and the bads and all of the possibilities that goes with being African. We must accept the fact that this white man is never going to accept us totally and get used to the idea. Hope is a wonderful thing in some senses, but it can be pathological in others. The neurotic individual uses hope in a pathological way. He lives in hope and does not know when to give it up. There's a time that hope has to be given up. When one looks at reality and recognizes reality for what it is, and one accepts certain aspects of that reality and moves on it. The hope that this white man is going to accept you as his own is one of those hopes that you must give up. The hope and the dream that you're going to be holding hands with little white boys and girls. And that the white man is going to feed your children before he feeds his own. That he's going to clothe you before he clothes his own. That he's going to give up his ill-gotten gain and wealth in the name of some kind of bogus brotherhood or classless society is a vain hope. Give it up. Turn it loose. And when you turn it loose, then you will see a growth and development of self. It would mean then an acceptance of self. And we see this then in Marcus Garvey as he got us to accept and tried to get us to accept the reality of ourselves and the reality of our Africanicity. He recognized, as we must recognize again today, that we cannot get self-acceptance through the acceptance of another people. That self-acceptance can only be achieved through the self. We must not wait for our enemies to approve of us and to so-called accept us as a way of accepting ourselves. Because, ladies and gentlemen, our enemies, their very lives, their very way of life depends upon our non-self-acceptance. And if the foundation of their very culture and the foundation of their very economic and social system and political system is one that is founded upon the subordination of black people, then you must recognize that they are not going to give that up, for it would be like giving up their very lives and their very existence itself. And therefore, for us to wait around in the vain hope that through their acceptance we'll come to accept ourselves is to wait for nothing, because we will gain nothing as a result of this kind of illusion. And we see then in Marcus Garvey and in his legacy a confrontation with self-acceptance and what all that implies. He helped us to accept ourselves, of course, through a study of our history and in a study of our past. But as I will emphasize a bit later on, we will see that he did not get stuck in history, that he was very much in the present and very much into the future. He recognized, as we must recognize today, ladies and gentlemen, that we cannot advance the interests of our people through the imitation of our oppressors. Sort of reminds me of that movie, Imitation of Life. Assuming that the oppressor represents life. And of course, one of the things that we must recognize is that our oppressor represents death. That our oppressor is deadly. One of the things that impressed me most when I went to graduate school and then really had my first real contact with the white education establishment. And one day I was leaving the university and I could just kept repeating to myself, these people are dead. No. They're dead. There's death around them somewhere. And which is the reason why they are deadly as a people. And the reason why every advancement in knowledge for them is an advancement in the knowledge of destruction. And every advancement in knowledge is an advancement in the ability to kill and destroy the earth, and to kill and destroy nature, and to kill and destroy others, and to rape and rob the earth of its wealth and of its people and of its life forms. So deadly until now they are having great difficulty even reproducing themselves. At the very center of their lives is death and destruction. We cannot imitate a people who are our oppressors, and we have this kind of silliness that goes on in the system today. You're going to complain on one hand about these racist people, about how they enslaved us, but how they exploited us, how they discriminate against us, and how they do this and how they do that, and then turn right around and see their behavior as something to be emulated, and to see their behavior as something to be imitated. Ladies and gentlemen, if you imitate your oppressor, if you identify with your oppressor, then since your oppressor treats us with disdain and degradation, and treats us with destructive impulses and desires, then will not the imitation of this oppressor mean that we would engage also in self-destruction and in self-degradation? If we behave the way our oppressor behaved, then won't we also engage in self-oppression? If we think the way our oppressor thinks, then won't we think about ourselves the way the oppressor thinks about us? If we talk the way our oppressor talks, then won't we curse ourselves the way the oppressor curses us? And when we ride these subways day in and day out, and we look at the behavior of our peoples in these communities, we can see a people imitating their oppressor. And in imitating their oppressors, they perform the work of the oppressor in terms of self-destruction and self-abnegation. Imitation of the oppressor then is equivalent to the treatment of the self and one's fellows as the oppressor would treat us. It is equal to the treatment of the self and the group in a destructive manner. It equals the lack of self-respect and respect for the group, since the oppressor lacks respect for us as individuals and as a group. If our oppressors exploit us, then the imitation of our oppressor means self-exploitation. So consequently, you see in the legacy of Marcus Garvey, a moving away from the imitation of our oppressors and a moving toward the identification with all that is African. Marcus Garvey, of course, recognized as well that we must, as people, love one another. And as all great teachers have taught, love is the foundation for any group's cohesiveness and unity of purpose. Love is the greatest inhibitor of aggression and internal conflict. It is the means by which the group cares and shares for itself and shares its resources. It is the means by which the group harnesses its resources and defends itself against the incursions of its enemies. We have a philosophy here today, ladies and gentlemen, that only permits love to take place often in terms of people outside of ourselves, in terms of people external to ourselves. At the center of the integrationist movement is this conscious and unconscious ideology that if we can get our enemies to love us, then we can get around to loving ourselves. But as I pointed out earlier, if the enemy's status, economic, social, and otherwise, relies on his cultivation and maintaining of a hatred toward us, then that enemy will never get around to loving us. And if we depend then upon our enemy loving us before we love ourselves, then we will never get around to loving ourselves. So consequently, we must forget about getting the enemy to love us and getting our oppressors to love us and so-called respect us. We must go directly and speak directly to our hearts and to our minds and love ourselves and love one another, because it is through that love that we advance our interests.